When Steve Harvey publicly mocked Clint Eastwood, everyone expected a joke. But what happened next shocked the entire room. Clint's calm response left the crowd speechless. And Steve, he didn't know what hit him. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you love inspiring stories, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow's story is even more special. It was a high-profile evening in Hollywood, the kind of event where the brightest stars and most influential figures gathered. The ballroom shimmered with elegance, crystal chandeliers hanging overhead, and the buzz of anticipation was palpable. This wasn't just any gathering. It was an annual celebration of Hollywood's elite, where the rich and famous shared the same space, mingling with ease. But on this particular night, an unexpected encounter was about to unfold, one that would become the talk of the town for years to come. The host of the evening, none other than Steve Harvey, took to the stage with his signature grin. Steve, famous for his quick wit and sharp humor, was well loved by the crowd. As the audience settled into their seats, they knew they were in for a night filled with laughter. Little did they know, Steve was planning something far beyond the usual jokes and banter. He had a target in mind. Among the sea of well-dressed celebrities and towering figures, Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, director, and Hollywood icon, sat quietly in the back. Clint, never one to seek the spotlight, dressed simply in a sharp suit that highlighted his ageless poise. His silent presence in the crowd spoke volumes more than any extravagant display of wealth or fame. Clint's reputation was legendary, not just for his acting skills, but for his stoic demeanor and unshakable calm. As Steve noticed Clint in the crowd, his mischievous smile widened. Without hesitation, he decided to call out the legend. "Hey, Clint, you looking a little too serious tonight. What's the matter? You're not in one of your westerns anymore." The crowd burst into laughter, but a subtle tension filled the air. Steve was known for his jokes, but Clint was known for his stone-cold silence, and that silence was about to speak volumes. What happened next would leave the audience stunned. As Steve's words hung in the air, a wave of laughter spread through the crowd. But it wasn't the typical kind of jovial, carefree chuckles that Steve usually evoked. This laughter felt different, almost awkward, as if the audience was unsure of how far Steve would take his teasing. Clint Eastwood, the man who had spent decades in the spotlight, known for playing the tough, unflinching cowboy, hadn't so much as flinched at Steve's public remark. His face remained calm and composed, as always. It was almost as if Clint was impervious to the world around him, immune to the attention that Steve was trying to draw. Clint's silence was a stark contrast to the lively banter of the event. He wasn't bothered, he wasn't angry, he wasn't offended, but in a way that made the situation even more intense. Steve, on the other hand, was enjoying himself, perhaps a little too much. The audience could see it in his eyes. He had made his mark on Clint, and he wasn't about to stop now. "Come on, Clint. You've been in movies with the toughest guys in Hollywood. You can crack a smile for us, can't you?" Steve pushed further, his voice dripping with sarcasm. At that moment, the tension in the room shifted. It wasn't just about the joke anymore. It was about the unspoken challenge that Clint had presented. Here was Steve, the master of comedy, attempting to rattle one of the most unflappable men in the industry. But instead of being taken aback, Clint simply remained still, a man who had been mocked many times before, but never responded in kind. His reaction, or lack thereof, was beginning to get noticed by everyone. And just when the atmosphere seemed to reach its peak, Clint Eastwood did something that would stun everyone. He had been quiet up until now, but it was his next move that would silence the room and leave Steve Harvey without a comeback. The room seemed to hold its breath as Steve continued to press Clint with his playful jabs. It was the kind of banter that Steve had mastered over the years, always knowing when to push and when to pull back. But this time was different. The more Steve teased Clint, the more it seemed that Clint wasn't even listening. It wasn't that Clint didn't hear Steve's remarks. Far from it. The legendary actor was acutely aware of every word, every playful insult that Steve threw his way. But Clint's reaction was deliberate, a demonstration of control that was both unnerving and commanding. While the rest of the room was laughing, Clint remained stoic. His face never cracked into a smile, nor did it show a hint of irritation. It was the calmness of a man who had seen it all, endured it all, and remained unfazed by the noise of the world. His silence was deafening, like a wall that Steve's words just couldn't penetrate. At first, Steve seemed to think that Clint was simply being tough, playing it cool. But as the seconds dragged on, Steve began to feel the weight of the situation. There was something about Clint's unyielding silence that was more powerful than any comeback or sharp remark could ever be. The crowd, once swept up in Steve's laughter, began to feel the shift. The playful tone of the evening had subtly changed. Steve, always the center of attention, was now facing something he wasn't used to, a challenge he couldn't win through humor alone. As Steve paused for a moment, unsure whether to continue, Clint slowly leaned forward. His gaze met Steve's eyes for the first time since the teasing began. There was no anger in Clint's eyes, no irritation, but there was something else, something that commanded respect. In that moment, Clint Eastwood spoke, and his words would silence the room completely. Clint Eastwood's gaze never wavered as he met Steve's eyes. There was no hint of the irritation that many might have expected, no sign of frustration. Instead, Clint's expression remained as calm and composed as ever. The entire room, once filled with the sounds of laughter, had fallen into an almost eerie silence. It was as if the air itself had thickened, and all eyes were now on Clint. Steve Harvey, who had always been the one in control, now found himself caught in the tension he had created. He had poked fun at one of the most iconic figures in Hollywood, and now for the first time, it felt like the joke was on him. The crowd, sensing the shift in energy, leaned in, eager to see how this would unfold. Clint's reputation as a seasoned actor and director was built on his unshakable presence, and it was clear to everyone now that he wasn't someone who would be easily rattled. Clint leaned back in his chair slightly, took a slow breath, and then with the same stoic calm that had defined his career, he spoke, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Steve," he said, his tone almost a whisper, yet it felt like every word was magnified in the room. "You've been joking around, and I get it, but you should know, there's more to a man than just what you see on the surface." Clint's words hung in the air, and in that instant, Steve knew the game had changed. The crowd, which had once been in stitches at Steve's playful jabs, now looked around at each other, sensing that Clint's calm response had shifted the entire dynamic. There was no anger in Clint's voice, but there was power, a quiet, undeniable authority that Steve had no choice but to acknowledge. Steve, visibly taken aback, didn't know how to respond. He had made his mark, but it was clear now that Clint's calm wisdom had silenced him. The crowd was stunned into silence, waiting for what would happen next. For a moment, Steve Harvey stood still, unsure of how to react. The laughter that had once filled the room now felt distant, almost like an echo fading into the background. Clint Eastwood's calm words had not only silenced Steve, but had shifted the entire atmosphere in the ballroom. The crowd, which had been expecting more comedic banter, now found themselves caught in an almost uncomfortable tension. Steve was known for being quick on his feet, always ready with a comeback or a punchline. But in that moment, he was taken aback. The power of Clint's silence was something Steve hadn't prepared for. Clint had not raised his voice, nor had he delivered a sharp retort. It was his unwavering composure, his unspoken strength, that had rendered Steve speechless. As Steve stood there trying to find the words to continue, Clint's calm presence seemed to fill the room. It was the kind of silence that wasn't just an absence of sound. It was the presence of something much greater. It was the kind of silence that demanded respect. The crowd began to feel the weight of the situation. Some looked at each other nervously, while others tried to hide their smiles, realizing that Steve's attempt to poke fun at Clint had backfired. Steve, usually the center of attention, now found himself in the rare position of being on the defensive. Clint's ability to remain unfazed by the public jabs made Steve look like a schoolyard bully who had just been outclassed by a master. It was clear now that Clint's reputation wasn't just built on his legendary acting or his directing career. It was built on his strength of character, his ability to remain calm and composed in even the most uncomfortable situations. As the seconds stretched on, Steve finally cleared his throat, his usual confident grin replaced with a subtle shift in demeanor. He had been bested by Clint Eastwood's silence, and for the first time in a long while, Steve found himself unsure of how to continue. The atmosphere in the ballroom had changed completely. What began as a light-hearted moment of Steve Harvey's playful banter had turned into an uncomfortable standoff between two men from very different worlds. Clint Eastwood, with his legendary career and reputation, had simply sat back and let Steve's words roll off him like water on a duck's back. Steve, ever the entertainer, realized he was no longer in control of the room. The crowd, who had once laughed along with him, was now watching closely, sensing that something important was unfolding. Steve, who was used to commanding attention and controlling the mood, had underestimated Clint. It wasn't just Clint's calm demeanor that had stunned him. It was his quiet ability to hold the room in complete suspense with just a few words. The more Steve thought about it, the more he realized that Clint wasn't just reacting to a joke. He wasn't playing along with the usual back-and-forth banter. Clint had sent a message, one that resonated far deeper than any joke could. The crowd's initial amusement had turned into a silent reverence for Clint's unflappable nature. Clint, in his usual understated way, had taken control of the moment without uttering a single boast or insult. The power was all in his ability to remain unshaken, to refuse to engage in the petty back and forth Steve had expected. As Steve looked around, he could see the change in the faces of the audience. They had gone from laughing at Steve's teasing to admiring Clint's grace under pressure. The mood in the room had shifted. No longer was it a comedy show. It was a lesson in how one man's composed response could diffuse an entire room of tension. Steve, still visibly taken aback, now had a choice to make. He could either double down and try to recover his momentum, or he could acknowledge that Clint had done something very few could do: silence him. For a brief moment, Steve Harvey stood there, weighing his options. He could feel the shift in the room, the energy that once seemed to surround him, like the excitement of a stand-up routine, had completely evaporated. What had started as a playful jab had now turned into an unexpected confrontation. Clint Eastwood, through his silence, had effectively taken the spotlight away from Steve. It wasn't that Clint had said anything cutting or controversial. It was that Clint had done nothing at all. His calmness was a quiet form of defiance, a subtle yet powerful reminder that some people simply don't need to react to be heard. The room had fallen into an uneasy quiet, the hum of conversation stilled by the weight of Clint's unspoken words. Steve was used to being the one in charge, always commanding a room with his charm and humor. But this time, he was facing someone whose presence was more powerful than any punchline he could deliver. Steve, always quick with his wit, now found himself searching for the right words, something to bring the room back to him. The challenge Clint presented was not one that could be easily beaten with another joke. It was a challenge that required more than humor. It required grace, something Steve hadn't prepared for. He was, after all, the entertainer, the one who made people laugh. But here, in front of the crowd, Clint had shown him a different kind of strength, a strength that came from remaining composed, from holding on to one's dignity in the face of public scrutiny. Steve Harvey had spent years perfecting his ability to make people laugh. But in this moment, Clint Eastwood had reminded him that some situations were too serious for laughter. They were too powerful for humor to diffuse. Steve's usual quick wit seemed to falter as he realized that the ball was no longer in his court. As the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, Steve Harvey realized something profound. The crowd, which had been so quick to laugh at his jokes moments before, was now holding their breath, watching to see what he would do next. Steve had built his career on the art of humor, on his ability to turn any situation into a moment of laughter. Yet here, before him, sat Clint Eastwood, a man whose mere presence was enough to silence the room. Steve had never encountered a moment like this in all his years of hosting and performing. He was used to being in control, to being the one who could dictate the flow of the event. But Clint, with nothing more than his calm silence, had taken that control from him. Steve, for the first time in a long time, found himself at a loss for words. He had come into this event with a plan to entertain, to charm, and to make people laugh. But Clint had changed the dynamics. It wasn't about humor anymore. It wasn't about making a joke and waiting for the crowd's approval. It was about respect. And Clint had earned that respect, not through a clever comeback or an elaborate speech, but through something far more powerful, his ability to remain composed under pressure. The room's energy had shifted. Where there had once been lightheartedness, there was now a sense of reverence. Steve, always the comedian, now stood before a legend, and he knew that the crowd was no longer looking for a punchline. They were waiting for Steve to acknowledge the moment, to recognize that Clint's quiet strength had turned the tables. Steve's usual quick wit had failed him, and in that instant, he realized that this wasn't just about humor. It was about understanding the power of silence, dignity, and composure. Clint Eastwood had proven that some moments required more than just words. The crowd continued to wait in silence, their eyes fixed on Steve, waiting for him to make his next move. There was no denying it. The energy had completely shifted. The usual light-hearted banter and playful jabs had been replaced with an almost palpable tension, one that seemed to hang in the air, thick with anticipation. Steve, ever the performer, had always been able to turn the tables in any conversation, always quick with a clever response or a humorous quip. But this was different. This was Clint Eastwood, a man whose reputation for silence and calm had been honed over decades in the public eye. Steve had crossed a line, thinking that he could just joke his way through it, but Clint had shown him a new side of power, the power of composure, of remaining unshaken. It wasn't just about laughing it off or shrugging off insults. Clint had taken what could have been a moment of public embarrassment and turned it into something else entirely, a lesson. Steve stood there reflecting on everything that had just happened. For the first time in his career, he found himself humbled by the very person he had tried to mock. Clint's calm response had not only silenced him, but it had also forced him to rethink what real strength looked like. Strength wasn't always about dominating the room with loud laughter or forceful wit. Sometimes it was about standing your ground without uttering a word. It was about allowing the situation to unfold without trying to control it. Steve had learned that lesson the hard way. He looked around at the audience, some of whom were still processing the shift in energy, while others seemed to nod in silent acknowledgement of Clint's quiet power. Steve's pride, normally his shield, had taken a hit, and for the first time he wasn't sure how to recover from it. But he knew one thing for sure: he would never forget this moment. The room was waiting, but Steve needed a moment to process the gravity of what had just happened. As the silence lingered, Steve Harvey finally took a deep breath, his usual quick wit now replaced by a sense of humility that had never been so clear. The playful banter that had filled the room moments ago seemed a distant memory. He could feel the weight of Clint Eastwood's gaze, not one of disdain or anger, but one that silently conveyed a message Steve would never forget. Clint, without raising his voice, without delivering a single harsh word, had made Steve realize the importance of something much greater than humor: respect. Clint's unflinching composure had completely shifted the dynamics of the evening. The crowd, who had been eagerly awaiting Steve's next joke, was now observing with bated breath, sensing the profound shift in the atmosphere. Steve, still processing the impact of Clint's response, turned his gaze to the audience. For the first time in his career, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. Instead, he stood there, absorbing the moment. It was clear to Steve that this wasn't about winning or losing a joke battle. It was about understanding the depth of another person's character, the kind of strength that doesn't need to be proclaimed or shouted, but quietly emanates from the inside. Steve's usual bravado had been replaced with an acknowledgement of Clint's power, a power that lay in his ability to remain unfazed. The room, still quiet, seemed to collectively recognize the lesson they had all just witnessed. Steve finally cleared his throat, his voice softer than usual, yet filled with newfound respect. "You're right, Clint," he said, nodding slightly. "I get it now." The crowd, sensing the sincerity in Steve's voice, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. It wasn't just an apology. It was a moment of mutual respect, the kind that only comes when one person fully understands the power of composure. And as Steve Harvey stood there, looking at Clint Eastwood, he knew that this was a lesson that would stay with him forever. In that one quiet moment, Clint had shown everyone that true strength lies not in making others laugh, but in knowing when to remain silent. If this story inspired you, make sure to subscribe for more powerful tales that touch the heart. Your support means everything. May God bless you.